In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where mighty empires clash with fleets numbering in the millions and weapons that can crack planets like eggs, there exists one universal truth that every civilized species has learned to accept. Never underestimate your enemy. Every species, that is, except when it comes to the humans. The pale, soft-skinned bipeds from the third rock of an unremarkable yellow star had been the subject of galactic comedy for decades. Their military was laughably small, barely 300,000 active personnel scattered across a handful of primitive worlds. Their weapons were chemically propelled metal projectiles. Their ships were held together with what appeared to be metallic tape and desperate prayers. Most amusing of all, they insisted on calling themselves the Terran Defense Corps, as if their pathetic collection of volunteers could defend anything against the technological marvels of true galactic powers. The Zephyrian Empire, with its billion-strong armadas and planet-killing dreadnoughts, had bigger parade formations than the entire human military. The crystalline Vorthan Collective could field more combat units from a single mining colony than Earth's entire space navy. Even the barbaric Krex Raiders possessed more firepower in their smallest raiding parties than humanity's most elite divisions. So when the humans dared to oppose the combined might of the Hegemony Alliance, a coalition of 12 major powers bent on claiming Earth's strategic position, the galaxy prepared to witness not a battle but an execution. Military analysts predicted the war would last exactly 47 minutes. Betting pools opened across civilized space, with odds focused not on who would win, but on whether the humans would surrender before or after the first shot was fired. The hegemony fleet that assembled at the edge of human space was a sight to behold. Over 10,000 vessels representing the pinnacle of galactic military might. Weapons capable of sterilizing continents. Shields that could deflect the fury of stars. Soldiers bred and trained for war across a dozen different worlds. Against this armada stood exactly 43 human ships, most of which appeared to be retrofitted cargo vessels, and approximately 50,000 troops who had never seen combat beyond their own solar system. The galaxy held its breath. Cameras rolled, and historians prepared to record the shortest military campaign in galactic history. They were about to witness something else entirely. What happened next would shatter every assumption about warfare, evolution, and the nature of intelligence itself. It would rewrite military doctrine across 1,000 worlds and force the galaxy to confront a terrifying truth that had been hiding in plain sight among the gentle, unremarkable humans. Some species evolved to be faster, others grew stronger, or smarter, or more technologically advanced. Humans evolved to be something far more dangerous. They evolved to win. Admiral Zix Thera of the Zephyrian Imperial Navy stood before the massive holographic display aboard her flagship, the Stellar Dominion, and tried to suppress what her species would have called amusement if they possessed such an emotion. The tactical readout showed the pathetic human defensive formation spread across their home system like scattered toys. "Analysis complete, Admiral," reported her tactical officer, a tall, crystalline being whose voice chimed like wind through metal. Human fleet composition: 43 vessels, largest measuring approximately 800 meters in length. Estimated firepower. The officer paused, double-checking his readings. Estimated firepower equivalent to perhaps 12 of our escort frigates. Around the command center, a ripple of what passed for laughter among the various alien species present swept through the assembled officers. The Hegemony Alliance had sent representatives from each member species to witness what they had termed the human pacification. Their flagship, continued the tactical officer, appears to be designated TDS Indomitable. "It is!" Another pause. "Admiral, it appears to be a converted cargo hauler. I'm detecting what look like external weapon mounts that have been, and I quote from our translation matrix, jury-rigged to the hull." Fleet Admiral Korvash of the Krex Raiders, a massive reptilian creature whose scales gleamed like black metal, let out a sound that could generously be called a chuckle. "They bolt guns to their trash haulers and call it a warship? Perhaps we should offer them some of our decommissioned training vessels. It would be more merciful than what they're flying now." Admiral Zix Thera studied the human formation more carefully. Something nagged at her tactical sense, though she couldn't identify what. The humans had positioned their vessels in what appeared to be a completely random pattern. No defensive lines, no concentrated firepower zones, no apparent tactical doctrine at all. "Admiral," her communications officer announced, "we're receiving a transmission from the human fleet. Audio and visual. Put it through." This should be entertaining. The holographic display shifted to show a human face. Zixthera had studied the species enough to know this was a male middle-aged by their standards with graying hair and lines around his eyes that humans called wrinkles. He wore a simple blue uniform with minimal ornamentation. "This is Rear Admiral Marcus Chen, commanding officer of the Terran Defense Corps. I am authorized to speak for Earth and her colonies." The human's voice was calm, almost conversational. "You are in violation of Terran space. You have 30 seconds to reverse course before we consider you a hostile force." The silence in the Hegemony Command Center lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before it erupted in sounds that roughly translated to laughter across a dozen species. Admiral Zixthera gestured for quiet. "Human, I am Admiral Zixthara of the Zephyrian Empire. Speaking for the Hegemony Alliance, we represent the combined military might of 12 galactic powers. You command 43 obsolete vessels and perhaps 50,000 troops. Are you seriously threatening us?" The human's expression didn't change. "I'm not threatening anyone, Admiral. I'm explaining the situation. You've entered Terran space without permission. Our laws are quite clear on this matter. Your laws?" Admiral Korvash leaned forward, his massive form blocking part of the display. "Little human, you command what we would consider a small raiding party. We have brought 10,000 vessels and 50 million soldiers. Your laws are meaningless here." For the first time, the human smiled. It was not a particularly pleasant expression. "Admiral, with respect, I don't think you understand the situation. You see, we're not raiders. We're not conquerors. We're not even particularly aggressive as a species." The smile widened slightly. "But you've made one critical error in your assessment. And what would that be?" Zixthera asked, genuinely curious now. "You assume that because our military is small, we're weak. Because our ships look primitive, they're ineffective. Because we're peaceful by nature, we don't know how to fight." Admiral Chen's eyes hardened. "Admiral, every human in my fleet is a volunteer. They're here because they choose to be, not because they were bred for it or conscripted into it. And every single one of them knows exactly what happens to their families if they fail today." The human leaned forward slightly. "You want to see what humans do when you threaten their children? You've got about 15 seconds to find out." Admiral Korvash made a dismissive gesture. "Pathetic threats from a pathetic species. This conversation is over." He turned to his tactical officer. "Signal all vessels. Begin the attack. Target their largest ships first. Let's end this quickly." Admiral Chen's image nodded slightly. "Understood. Chen out." The transmission ended. Zixthera watched the tactical display as 10,000 hegemony vessels began their advance. The human fleet made no move to retreat or reposition. They simply waited. "Human vessels are not moving, Admiral," her tactical officer reported. "They appear to be holding position, probably paralyzed with fear," Admiral Korvash suggested. "Their weapons are powering up, but their propulsion systems seem to be running minimal power." As the massive hegemony fleet closed to weapons range, what she had initially dismissed as random positioning now seemed almost deliberate. The human ships were scattered throughout the system in what looked like chaos, but each vessel had clear lines of fire to multiple approach vectors. "Admiral," her sensor officer called out, voice tight with confusion, "I'm reading massive energy spikes from several of the asteroids in this system. They appear to be artificial." Before Zixthara could respond, space around her fleet erupted in fire. The asteroids weren't asteroids at all. but carefully disguised human weapons platforms. Massive railguns that had been built into the rocky bodies opened fire simultaneously, sending streams of hypervelocity projectiles into the tightly packed hegemony formation. The rounds were primitive by galactic standards, simple metal slugs accelerated to tremendous velocity, but they struck with the force of tactical nuclear weapons. "Evasive maneuvers!" Zixthara shouted, but the hegemony formation was too large and too tightly packed to maneuver quickly. Ship after ship disappeared in brilliant flashes as the primitive human projectiles punched through their shields like they weren't there. "How?" Admiral Korvash demanded. "Their weapons shouldn't be able to penetrate our shields." Zixthara's tactical officer was frantically analyzing the incoming fire. "Admiral, the projectiles are moving at nearly 15% of light speed. At those velocities, our energy shields are useless. They're designed to deflect energy weapons, not kinetic projectiles at relativistic speeds." The human fleet began moving now, but not in any formation Zixthara recognized. Each ship seemed to be acting independently, darting between the larger hegemony vessels like angry insects. Their weapons, simple chemical rockets and railguns, shouldn't have been a threat to proper military vessels. But they weren't aiming at the ships. "Admiral," her engineering officer called out in panic, "they're targeting our weapon hardpoints. And our engine nacelles. They're trying to disable us, not destroy us." Zixthara watched in growing horror as her magnificent fleet was systematically dismantled by a force a fraction of its size. The humans weren't fighting like any civilized military she had ever encountered. They fought like predators, she whispered. Each human vessel moved with purpose and precision, striking at weak points that shouldn't have been visible to their primitive sensors. But somehow, impossibly, they knew exactly where to hit each different class of ship for maximum effect. Admiral Chen. She broadcast on all frequencies. "Admiral Chen, please respond." The human face appeared on her screen again, calm as before despite the battle raging around him. "Yes, Admiral?" "How?" was all she could manage. Admiral Chen smiled that same unpleasant smile. "You really want to know?" "Every ship in your fleet was built by a different species, using different technologies, different materials, different design philosophies. You assumed that would give you an advantage. A dozen different military traditions working together." A massive Krex dreadnought exploded silently in the background of Chen's transmission as human fighters swarmed over it like metallic locusts. "But here's what you didn't consider, Admiral. For the past 50 years, humans have been buying your decommissioned ships, studying them, taking them apart piece by piece. We've been learning how each of your species thinks about warfare, about engineering, about tactics. We know exactly how a Zephyrian shields generator fails under stress. We know exactly how much kinetic force a Krex engine mount can withstand before it shears off." The transmission flickered as the TDS Indomitable rolled to avoid return fire from a Vorthan cruiser.
"You see, Admiral, you fight the way your species evolved to fight."
Zephyrians use overwhelming technological superiority. Krex rely on brute force and intimidation. Vorthans employ perfect coordination and hive mind tactics. Jen's eyes gleamed. But humans? We evolved to hunt things bigger than us. We evolved to study our prey, learn their weaknesses, and exploit them. Another section of the hegemony fleet went dark as their command ships found themselves isolated and overwhelmed by swarms of small, fast human vessels. "We've been preparing for this day since we first met you," Chen continued. "Every cultural exchange, every trade agreement, every diplomatic mission, we were learning, we were watching, we were getting ready." Zixthara looked at her tactical display. In less than 30 minutes, her 10,000 ship fleet had been reduced to barely 3,000 operational vessels. The humans had lost perhaps a dozen ships. "This is impossible," she breathed. "No, Admiral. This is evolution. And you just discovered what happens when you threaten a species that spent 1,000,000 years learning to kill things that were bigger, stronger, and faster than they were." Admiral Chen's image leaned forward one last time. Now let's discuss those surrender terms. The greatest military force the galaxy had ever assembled found itself staring defeat in the face, inflicted by a species they had dismissed as harmless primitives. But as Ixthara was beginning to understand, the humans had never been primitive. They had simply been patient. Captain Sarah Martinez crouched in the cramped bridge of the TDS Persistence, a ship that had been hauling grain between Earth's agricultural colonies just 6 months ago. Now it bristled with improvised weapon systems and sensor arrays that her grandmother would have called creative engineering and military professionals would have called insane. Contact bearing 27 Mark IV, reported her tactical officer, Lieutenant Zhang. Looks like a hegemony-heavy cruiser trying to break away from the main engagement. Sarah studied the sensor reading. The enemy ship was massive, nearly 2 kilometers long and bristling with enough firepower to level a small city. By every conventional military standard, her converted cargo hauler should have been running away as fast as its patched-together engines could carry it. Instead, she smiled. "Jenny, how's our friend looking?" she called to her sensor specialist, a young woman who had been analyzing alien ship designs since she was 12 years old. "It's a Corvallis-class heavy cruiser, Captain. Zephyrian design, commissioned about 15 years ago." Jenny's voice carried the excitement of someone who had spent years studying something they finally got to see in action. Twin energy shields, redundant power systems, and, oh, this is interesting. It's running on backup power to the port shield generators. Sarah's smile widened. Meaning? Meaning. Someone already gave it a love tap and they're compensating by rerouting power from the secondary systems. If I had to guess, their environmental controls are probably running at minimal power right now. Lieutenant Zhang looked confused. How does that help us? Our weapons still can't punch through their primary shields. Who said anything about weapons? Sarah activated the ship's communication system. Persistence to Hunter Pack 7, come in. The response crackled through the speakers immediately. Hunter Pack 7 here, Captain. We have you on scope. Jenny, transmit the target's shield harmonics and power distribution to the pack. Full analysis. Transmitted, Captain. Sarah watched her tactical display as 6 small human fighters, each barely the size of a hegemony escape pod, began moving toward the massive cruiser. To any observer, it would look like insects attacking a giant. The hegemony ship noticed the fighters approaching and began rotating to bring its main guns to bear. Energy blasts the size of subway cars lanced out toward the tiny human vessels, but they jinked and weaved through the fire with an agility that seemed to violate physics. How are they moving like that? Zhang asked, watching the display in amazement. Sarah's answer came from years of studying what made humans different from every other species they had encountered. Because they're not following a flight plan, Lieutenant. Every other species in the galaxy programs their fighters with tactical algorithms and optimal flight paths. Our pilots are making it up as they go along. On the display, the human fighters closed with the cruiser, but instead of attacking it directly, they began darting around the massive ship's hull like hummingbirds around a flower. Each fighter carried what military manuals would generously call improvised electromagnetic pulse devices, basically massive batteries rigged to discharge their entire contents in a single burst. The fighters didn't attack the ship's shields or weapons. Instead, they targeted the external sensor arrays, communication dishes, and cooling vents scattered across the hull. Each EMP burst was small by military standards, but precisely placed. What are they doing? Zhang asked, watching the fighters dance around the giant ship without apparently causing any damage. Jenny was monitoring her sensors with growing excitement. They're not trying to damage the ship, Lieutenant. They're giving it a fever. Sarah nodded approvingly. Explain it to him, Jenny. The cruiser's environmental systems are already running at minimal power to maintain shield strength, Jenny said, her voice animated with the pleasure of watching a perfect plan unfold. But those systems depend on external cooling vents and heat exchangers to maintain optimal operating temperature for the crew. On the display, the fighters finished their work and began withdrawing. The massive cruiser continued on its course, apparently undamaged. Now we wait, Sarah said calmly. For what? Zhang asked. For biology to do the heavy lifting. It took exactly 14 minutes. Sarah's crew watched their sensors as the hegemony cruiser's energy output began to fluctuate, first slightly, then more dramatically. "Captain," Jenny reported, "I'm reading massive internal temperature spikes throughout the enemy vessel. They're venting atmosphere from multiple decks." Zhang stared at his tactical display in disbelief. "They're overheating?" "Zephyrians evolved on a cold world," Sarah explained calmly. "Their optimal body temperature is about 40 degrees below human normal. Their ships are designed to maintain that temperature." She gestured at the display. "Our fighters didn't attack their weapons or engines. They attacked their air conditioning." On the screen, the massive cruiser was now venting atmosphere from dozens of hull breaches as emergency systems tried to cool the ship. The crew, Sarah knew, would be experiencing the equivalent of extreme heat stroke. Higher brain functions would be shutting down. Military discipline would be giving way to animal panic. "Persistence to enemy cruiser," Sarah broadcast. "This is Captain Martinez of the Terran Defense Corps. You are experiencing life support failure. We can offer assistance if you surrender your vessel immediately." The response came within seconds, the alien voice distorted by what sounded like severe distress. "Terran vessel. This is Captain Xeris of the Imperial cruiser Dominator. We accept your offer of assistance. We surrender." George Dal, Sarah's tactical officer, stared at her in amazement. "Captain, we just captured a heavy cruiser without firing a shot." "Better than that, Lieutenant. We captured it intact, with full crew complement and all their military intelligence databases." Sarah keyed the intercom. "Engineering, prepare a boarding party. Medical team as well. Our guests are going to need help cooling down." As her crew prepared to take control of a ship that outmassed theirs by a factor of 50, Sarah reflected on what made this all possible. The Hegemony Alliance had made the same mistake that human prey animals had been making for millions of years. They had focused on the obvious threats while ignoring the actual danger. Every species in the galaxy thought about warfare in terms of bigger weapons, stronger shields, faster ships. They optimized for direct confrontation because that's how their evolution had shaped them. Predator species like the Kreks relied on overwhelming force. Prey species like the Vorthans depended on coordination and numbers, but humans had evolved as persistence hunters. They had spent 1,000,000 years learning to bring down creatures faster, stronger, and more dangerous than themselves by studying their weaknesses and exploiting them patiently. The hegemony had brought overwhelming firepower to a tactical problem. The humans had brought science. Across the solar system, similar scenes were playing out as human forces systematically dismantled the greatest military fleet the galaxy had ever assembled. Not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through a profound understanding of exactly how each enemy fought, how they thought, and most importantly, how they failed. The TDS Persistence received new orders as she prepared to take possession of her prize. "All units, this is Admiral Chen. Phase 1 is complete. Initiate Phase 2 protocols. Remember, we're not trying to destroy them, we're trying to collect them." Sarah smiled as she realized that the surrender of one of the hegemony's most powerful ships was just the beginning. The human fleet wasn't just winning a battle, they were conducting the largest intelligence-gathering operation in galactic history. Every surrendered ship meant access to military databases, tactical algorithms, technology specifications, and cultural intelligence that would take decades to acquire through conventional means. The Hegemony Alliance had brought the humans the greatest gift they could have asked for: detailed examples of exactly how every major military power in the galaxy thought about warfare. As boarding parties from the Persistence began moving toward the surrendered cruiser, Sarah reflected on something her grandfather had once told her about hunting. The most dangerous prey is the one that learns from every encounter. The galaxy was about to discover just how quickly humans learned. Throughout the system, the pattern repeated. Human forces using improvised tactics, makeshift weapons, and intimate knowledge of alien physiology and psychology to systematically capture or disable ships that should have been able to destroy them without effort. The ridiculous little human army wasn't just winning, They were rewriting the fundamental assumptions about what made a military force effective. Size, firepower, and advanced technology were meaningless if your enemy understood exactly how to make them work against you. In the command centers of a dozen alien species, military analysts were frantically trying to understand how their overwhelming advantage had turned into a complete disaster. They would spend years analyzing the tactical recordings from this battle, and they would all reach the same disturbing conclusion. Humanity hadn't just won through luck or clever tricks. They had demonstrated a form of warfare that no one in the galaxy was prepared for. Conflict as biological science, where victory went not to the strongest or the fastest, but to the species that best understood the ecosystem they were fighting in. The Hegemony Alliance had entered human space expecting to face primitives armed with crude weapons. Instead, they had encountered the most sophisticated predators the galaxy had ever produced. Deep within the asteroid belt surrounding Jupiter, Commander Elena Vasquez watched the largest military disaster in galactic history unfold according to plan. Her command ship, the TDS Relentless, was buried inside a hollowed-out asteroid that had taken 3 years to prepare. Around her, the remnants of the Hegemony fleet were discovering that their retreat was blocked by an enemy that shouldn't have existed. "Status report," Elena requested calmly, sipping coffee from a mug that bore the inscription, "World's Greatest Grandma," a gift from her daughter that had somehow seemed appropriate for this moment. "Hegemony forces have fallen back to the Jupiter perimeter as projected," reported Major Kim, her tactical coordinator. "They're attempting to establish a defensive formation around their command carriers." Elena studied the three-dimensional tactical display that dominated her command center. The surviving Hegemony ships, still numbering nearly 2,000, had formed a classic defensive spear around their massive command vessels. It was textbook military doctrine, the kind taught at academies across the galaxy. It was also exactly what the humans had been counting on. "They're following the Aldani defensive protocol," observed Lieutenant Commander Torres, the fleet's xenobiologist. "Logical choice, given their situation. Concentrate firepower, establish overlapping fields of fire, make any attacker pay dearly for every meter gained. And they have no idea they're sitting in the middle of a trap that we started building 50 years ago," Elena replied. She activated the communication system. "All units, this is Commander Vasquez. Initiate Protocol Arachnid." Around the Jupiter system, the asteroids began to move. Admiral Zixthera was still trying to understand how her overwhelming military advantage had turned into a nightmare when her sensors detected the new contacts. At first, her tactical officers dismissed them as debris from the battle, chunks of destroyed ships drifting on ballistic trajectories. Then the debris began changing course. "Admiral," her sensor operator reported with barely controlled panic, "I'm reading propulsion signatures from approximately 300 objects that were previously classified as asteroids. They're moving toward us." Zixthera felt something that her species had no name for but humans would have called dread. Analysis. "What are we looking at?" Her tactical officer worked frantically at his console. "Based on propulsion signatures and course corrections, these appear to be camouflaged vessels. But Admiral, the energy readings are unusual." "Define unusual." "They're showing almost no weapon signatures, minimal shields, and power outputs that suggest crews of perhaps 5 to 10 individuals per vessel." Admiral Korvash, whose own flagship was barely holding together after losing most of its weapon systems to a swarm of human fighters, snarled his frustration. "More of their converted cargo ships? How many of these ridiculous vessels do they have?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Admiral Chen's face appeared on the communication screen, still wearing that same unsettling smile. "Not cargo ships, Admiral Korvash, mining vessels. Specifically, automated asteroid miners that we've been placing throughout this system for the past 5 decades. Chen's image showed him standing in what appeared to be a control center carved from solid rock. "You see, when humanity first ventured into space, we didn't have the luxury of vast military budgets or centuries of technological development. We had to make do with what we could afford. On the tactical display, the disguised mining vessels continued their approach, moving with the slow, inexorable patience of machines that had been designed to work in space for decades without maintenance. What we could afford, Chen continued, was to buy obsolete mining equipment from a dozen different species and modify it for our own purposes. Officially, we were using it to establish mining operations throughout our solar system. Zixthara watched the approaching vessels with growing alarm. They were moving too slowly to be an immediate threat, but their sheer numbers were overwhelming. And unofficially, we were building the most extensive automated weapons network the galaxy has ever seen. Chen's smile widened. Each of those miners has been modified to carry exactly one payload, a nuclear device with a yield equivalent to about 50 megatons. The command center of the Stellar Dominion fell completely silent. Nuclear weapons? Admiral Korvash's voice carried a note of disbelief. You're threatening us with primitive atomic weapons? Our shields can deflect nuclear blasts without difficulty. Oh, I'm sure they can, Chen agreed pleasantly. One nuclear blast, or even a dozen. But Admiral, you're looking at 300 simultaneous detonations, all carefully calculated to create a cascade resonance effect in your defensive formation. Elena Vasquez, monitoring the conversation from her hidden command center, felt a surge of professional pride. The plan they were executing had been years in the making, requiring not just military expertise but deep understanding of physics, psychology, and alien engineering principles.
You see, Chen continued, humans have a saying, if you can't be smarter, be more precise.
We spent 50 years studying every shield technology, every defensive protocol, every tactical doctrine used by major galactic powers, and we discovered something interesting. The mining vessels had reached optimal positioning surrounding the hegemony fleet in a perfect three-dimensional web. Every shield system has a resonance frequency. Every defensive formation has optimal spacing requirements. Every tactical doctrine has underlying assumptions about how attacks will be structured. Chen's expression grew serious. And every military force in the galaxy has been fighting the same way for so long that they've forgotten to consider alternative approaches. Admiral Zixthara's tactical officer was running frantic calculations. Admiral, if they detonate all those devices simultaneously at those positions, his voice trailed off as he stared at his results. What? She demanded. The cascade effect would create a gravitational anomaly, not large enough to be dangerous by itself, but it would disrupt our formation cohesion and create interference patterns in our shield matrices. Elena keyed her communication system. Admiral Chen, the hegemony fleet is in position. All mining platforms report ready for final phase. Gentlemen, Chen addressed the alien commanders directly, you have 30 seconds to order your fleets to surrender before we demonstrate what happens when 300 nuclear devices detonate in precise sequence around a tightly packed military formation. Admiral Korvash made a sound of derision. You think we'll be intimidated by... His words were cut off as one of the mining platforms detonated, far enough from the fleet to avoid damage but close enough to demonstrate the weapon's power. The nuclear flash illuminated the entire asteroid belt, and the gravitational pulse that followed sent ripples through every shield matrix in the hegemony formation. 29 seconds, Chen said calmly. Elena watched the alien commanders process their situation. The nuclear devices weren't powerful enough to destroy their ships individually, but 300 simultaneous detonations would create a chaos of gravitational waves, electromagnetic pulses, and interference patterns that would render their defensive formation useless. More importantly, it would leave their fleet scattered and disoriented, perfect targets for the human forces that were already moving into attack positions throughout the asteroid belt. Admiral Chen, Zixthara said finally, you're asking us to surrender the largest military fleet ever assembled to a force that numbers in the dozens. No, Admiral, I'm asking you to surrender to a force that has spent 50 years preparing for this exact moment. Numbers don't matter when one side understands the battlefield better than the other. Elena smiled as she watched the tactical display. The hegemony commanders were finally beginning to understand what they were facing. This wasn't a military engagement in any conventional sense. It was a scientific experiment with a predetermined outcome. 15 seconds, Chen announced. This is Admiral Zixthara of the Zephyrian Empire, came the response, the alien's voice heavy with defeat. On behalf of the Hegemony Alliance, I order all ships to power down weapons and prepare for surrender. Elena felt a wave of satisfaction wash over her command center. Around Jupiter, 300 nuclear devices powered down their detonation sequences as thousands of alien warships began the process of surrender. All units, this is Admiral Chen. Phase 3 complete. Initiate boarding procedures and begin intelligence collection protocols. As human forces began the massive undertaking of securing and cataloging the largest fleet in galactic history, Elena reflected on what they had accomplished. The Hegemony Alliance had brought overwhelming force to what they thought would be a simple conquest. Instead, they had walked into a trap that had been 50 years in the making, constructed by a species that had learned to turn every disadvantage into an advantage, every weakness into a strength. The ridiculous little human army had just captured the combined military might of 12 galactic powers without losing a single major engagement. More importantly, they had done it in a way that preserved both the ships and their crews, ensuring that humanity would have access to every piece of military intelligence, technology, and tactical knowledge that the galaxy's great powers possessed. But perhaps the most significant victory wasn't military at all. Across the galaxy, military analysts and political leaders were beginning to realize that their fundamental assumptions about human capabilities had been completely wrong. The peaceful, primitive species from the third planet of an unremarkable star hadn't been weak or backward. They had been patient, methodical, and utterly focused on understanding exactly what they would need to do when the galaxy inevitably came calling. Elena raised her coffee mug in a silent toast to her daughter, whose future was now secure in a galaxy that would never again make the mistake of underestimating humanity. The greatest military force the galaxy had ever assembled had just learned what humans meant when they said they would defend their homes. Some lessons, Elena reflected, were worth teaching properly. 3 days after the surrender of the Hegemony Alliance, Rebecca Walsh found herself in the most unlikely place she had ever imagined, aboard the bridge of a Zephyrian super-dreadnought, surrounded by alien technology that represented centuries of advancement beyond human capabilities, while the ship's former crew waited nervously for her assessment of their vessel. Rebecca wasn't a military officer. She was a xenobiologist who had spent 20 years studying alien psychology and behavior patterns, originally as part of humanity's diplomatic corps. Now, as she watched Admiral Zixthara demonstrate the ship's primary weapons systems under the watchful eye of a human security team, she realized that her real job had never been diplomacy at all. The primary energy cannons can generate a sustained beam with the destructive equivalent of approximately 500 megatons per second, Admiral Zixthara explained, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who still couldn't quite believe her situation. Range is effectively unlimited in void combat, with targeting accuracy maintained across distances of several light minutes. Lieutenant Torres, Rebecca's military liaison, whistled appreciatively. That's enough firepower to sterilize a continent in seconds. It is Zixthara. This single vessel carries more destructive capacity than your entire species possessed 6 months ago. Rebecca smiled politely while making notes on her tablet. What she was really doing was cataloging the psychological markers that made Zephyrian military technology possible. The aliens thought she was there to understand their weapons. In reality, she was there to understand them. Admiral, she said carefully, I'm curious about the tactical philosophy behind mounting such powerful weapons on a single platform. It seems inefficient from a resource allocation standpoint. Zixthara's expression, as much as Rebecca could read alien facial expressions, showed surprise. Inefficient? This vessel represents the pinnacle of military engineering. The concentration of firepower allows for decisive engagement resolution with minimal resource expenditure. Of course, Rebecca agreed, but it also represents a tremendous concentration of resources in a single vulnerable platform. What happens if the ship is disabled or destroyed? The alien admiral gestured to her tactical display. Such an outcome is highly improbable. This vessel's defensive systems are virtually impregnable. and our tactical doctrine ensures that it operates with extensive escort formations. Rebecca nodded while internally noting another critical piece of the puzzle. Zephyrian military thinking was built around the concept of overwhelming technological superiority. They created individual platforms so powerful that they couldn't conceive of them being threatened by inferior technology. It was a mindset that made perfect sense for a species that had evolved to solve problems through technological innovation rather than adaptability, Dr. Ketchavan. Walsh, Lieutenant Torres said quietly, "We're ready for the next demonstration." They moved to the ship's command center where Admiral Zixthara's tactical staff was preparing to show how their battle management systems worked. Rebecca watched with fascination as the aliens demonstrated coordination protocols that could manage the movements and actions of thousands of ships simultaneously. Each vessel in our fleet receives continuous tactical updates through our command network, explained the ship's tactical officer, a tall Zephyrian whose name Rebecca's translation software rendered as something like precise thought in combat. All major tactical choices are processed through the command hierarchy and optimized for maximum efficiency. Rebecca made more notes while considering the implications. Zephyrian fleet tactics relied on perfect information and centralized decision-making. Every ship knew exactly what every other ship was doing at all times, and the fleet moved like a single enormous organism. It was tactically elegant and highly effective, as long as the enemy played by the same rules. "Fascinating," Rebecca said aloud. "And this system has proven effective in your previous military engagements?" "Universally," Precise Thought in Combat replied with obvious pride. "No force has ever successfully opposed a properly organized Zephyrian battle fleet." The alien officer's expression darkened. 3 days ago was an anomaly. Your forces employed tactics that our systems were not designed to counter. Rebecca smiled. "What kind of tactics?" Admiral Zixthara answered. "Chaos. Pure chaos. Your ships acted independently, without coordination, following no discernible tactical doctrine. Our command systems couldn't predict your movements because there was no pattern to predict." "I see. So your tactical advantage depends on being able to predict and counter enemy actions?" "All effective military doctrine requires the ability to anticipate and respond to enemy behavior." Rebecca exchanged a glance with Lieutenant Torres. This was the key insight they had been looking for. Every major military power in the galaxy had evolved tactics based on predictable, optimized responses to threats. They had created military doctrines so sophisticated and refined that they had become rigid. Humans, on the other hand, had evolved as opportunistic hunters. They had learned to succeed by adapting to whatever circumstances they encountered, rather than by optimizing for specific scenarios. "Admiral," Rebecca said carefully, "would you be willing to answer some questions about human tactical behavior during the recent engagement? If it would be helpful to your understanding, yes. From your perspective, what was the most confusing aspect of human military behavior?" Zixthara considered the question seriously. "Your forces seem to make decisions based on incomplete information. Our analysis showed that individual human commanders often acted without knowing the full tactical situation, yet their actions consistently supported your overall strategic goals." Rebecca nodded. "What else?" "Your ships engaged targets that were not optimal from a purely tactical standpoint. Instead of concentrating fire on our most dangerous vessels, you targeted ships that seemed to be selected almost randomly. And that was problematic because it prevented us from predicting which of our vessels were in immediate danger. We couldn't properly allocate defensive resources or plan tactical withdrawals." Lieutenant Torres leaned forward. "So the humans' refusal to follow optimal tactics actually became a tactical advantage?" "Precisely. We had prepared for an engagement with an opponent who would attempt to maximize their combat effectiveness through logical tactical choices. Instead, we faced an opponent who maximized their effectiveness by making us unable to respond logically to their actions." Rebecca felt a surge of excitement as the pieces fell into place. The human military hadn't won through superior firepower or advanced technology. They had won by being fundamentally unpredictable to enemies who had spent centuries optimizing their responses to predictable threats. Every species in the galaxy had evolved military doctrines based on their particular strengths. technological superiority, overwhelming force, perfect coordination, or specialized weapon systems. Those doctrines had been refined through countless engagements against other species using similar approaches. But humans had evolved something entirely different. They had learned to succeed by being adaptable rather than optimal, by responding to circumstances rather than following predetermined plans, by being willing to accept apparent inefficiencies if they led to unexpected advantages. "Admiral," Rebecca said, "I have one more question. Looking back at the engagement, what would you have needed to know about human tactics to successfully counter them?" Zixthera was quiet for a long moment. "That is the most disturbing aspect of your question, Dr. Walsh. I don't believe our tactics could have countered yours, regardless of our preparation." "Why not?" "Because effective military doctrine requires consistency. We must be able to train our forces to respond appropriately to specific threats, but your forces seem to change their approach continuously throughout the engagement. By the time we identified a human tactical pattern and developed a response, your forces had already shifted to a different approach." Rebecca smiled. "So you're saying that predictability is essential to your military effectiveness, but unpredictability was essential to ours?" "Yes, and that suggests—" Zixthera paused, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of her own analysis. "What?" "That suggests that humans possess a form of military capability that may be inherently superior to conventional approaches, regardless of relative technological or numerical advantages." Lieutenant Torres whistled softly. "In other words, we don't just have a different military doctrine, we have a different relationship with warfare itself." Rebecca made final notes on her tablet as she considered what they had learned. The Hegemony Alliance hadn't been defeated by human military superiority in any conventional sense. They had been defeated by a species that approached conflict from a fundamentally different evolutionary perspective. Every other species in the galaxy had developed military capabilities as extensions of their natural survival strategies, technological advancement, numerical superiority, physical dominance, or cooperative coordination. Humans had developed something else entirely. They had learned to treat warfare as an ecosystem where the most successful predators were those that could adapt to any environment, exploit any opportunity, and turn any apparent disadvantage into a strategic asset. "Admiral," Rebecca said as they prepared to leave the command center, "thank you for your cooperation. Your insights have been invaluable." "Dr. Walsh, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Was this really about defending your world, or was this some form of elaborate research project?" Rebecca considered the question carefully before answering. "Admiral, for humans those are the same thing. We defend ourselves by understanding everything that might threaten us, and understanding our enemies has always been our greatest strength." As they left the captured super dreadnought, Rebecca reflected on what humanity had really accomplished. They hadn't just won a military victory, they had demonstrated that their approach to survival was fundamentally more adaptable than anything the galaxy had previously encountered. The ridiculous little human army had revealed itself to be something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined, a military force that grew stronger not through technological advancement or numerical superiority, but through understanding and adapting to whatever it faced. And now, with access to the military knowledge and technology of 12 galactic powers, humanity was about to become even more dangerous. The galaxy was beginning to understand that they hadn't just underestimated human military capabilities. They had fundamentally misunderstood what humans were capable of becoming when properly motivated. Some discoveries, Rebecca knew, changed everything. This was one of them. 6 months after the surrender of the Hegemony Alliance, Ambassador James Sullivan stood before the Galactic Council Assembly and tried to project an air of humble diplomacy while representing a species that had just fundamentally altered the balance of power in known space. The vast assembly hall contained representatives from over 400 species, many of whom were still struggling to understand how the galaxy's political landscape had changed overnight. The humans had been invited to address the council not as the primitive species they had been dismissed as, but as the newest and potentially most dangerous military power the galaxy had ever encountered. "Honored representatives," James began, his voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. I want to begin by addressing the concerns that have been raised about human military capabilities and intentions. In the gallery reserved for major powers, he could see the remaining leadership of the Hegemony Alliance species. Admiral Zixthara sat with the Zephyrian delegation, her presence a visible reminder of how completely human forces had outmaneuvered the galaxy's finest military minds. The recent conflict in our system was not initiated by humanity. We defended our homes against an invasion force that outnumbered us by factors that should have made resistance impossible. Yet here we stand, and I believe that fact has raised questions about the nature of human military doctrine that deserve honest answers. Chancellor Vex High of the Vorthan Collective leaned forward in his crystalline chair. Ambassador Sullivan, our analysis indicates that human forces captured or disabled over 70% of hegemony vessels without destroying them. This suggests a level of tactical precision that exceeds anything in our military databases. You're correct, Chancellor. Human military doctrine prioritizes minimizing casualties and preserving infrastructure whenever possible. But how? Demanded General Korvash, speaking for the Krex delegation. Our weapons are more powerful, our ships are larger, our technology is more advanced. By every logical measure, the hegemony should have achieved total victory within hours. James smiled. General, you're absolutely right about the technological disparities. Human ships, weapons, and defensive systems are primitive compared to galactic standards. But I think you're asking the wrong question, which is, you're asking how we won with inferior technology. The real question is why you assumed that superior technology would guarantee victory. The assembly hall fell silent as delegates considered the implications of that statement. For over 2,000 years, James continued, galactic military doctrine has been built on the assumption that technological and numerical superiority determines outcomes. Species have invested enormous resources in developing more powerful weapons, larger fleets, and more sophisticated tactical systems. He gestured to the displays around the hall, which showed technical specifications from various military forces throughout the galaxy. But humans evolved on a world where the most successful predators were not the strongest or the fastest. They were the most adaptable. We learn to succeed by understanding our environment better than anything else in it. Ambassador Silex of the Aldani Confederacy raised one of her forearms. Ambassador, you speak of adaptation, but military effectiveness requires consistency. How does adaptability translate to strategic advantage? James had been waiting for this question. Ambassador Silex, your military doctrine emphasizes coordinated fleet actions based on optimal tactical formations, correct? Of course, coordination and optimization are the foundations of effective military action, and that doctrine has served you well in engagements with other species who share similar approaches to warfare.
Yes, but what happens when you encounter an opponent who succeeds by being inconsistent?
Who treats each engagement as a unique problem requiring a unique solution? The Aldani delegate was quiet for a moment. Such an approach would be difficult to counter with conventional tactics. Exactly. Every species in the galaxy has developed military capabilities that work extremely well against opponents using similar approaches. You've all been optimizing your forces to fight versions of yourselves. James activated a holographic display that showed the tactical patterns from the recent engagement. Human forces didn't follow any of the established tactical doctrines represented in this hall. Our technology wasn't advanced enough to support your approaches to warfare. The display showed human ships moving in seemingly random patterns, attacking targets that appeared to have no tactical significance and using weapons combinations that violated standard military logic. So instead we fought the way humans have always fought, by studying our enemies, identifying their weaknesses, and exploiting those weaknesses through methods they hadn't prepared for. Chancellor Vexai's voice carried a note of unease. You're describing warfare as a form of scientific research. In many ways, that's exactly what it is. Every species, every technology, every tactical doctrine has inherent limitations. Human military doctrine is built around identifying and exploiting those limitations. General Corvash made a sound of frustration, but that approach requires detailed knowledge of enemy capabilities. How could humans possibly have acquired such extensive intelligence about hegemony forces? James smiled again. General, humans have been active in galactic society for over 50 years. We've been students, researchers, diplomats, traders, and tourists. We've visited your world, studied in your universities, worked in your industries, and served as observers in your military exercises. The implications of that statement sent a ripple of unease through the assembly. You're telling us that human intelligence gathering has been ongoing for decades? Admiral Zixthera asked from her position with the Zephyrian delegation.
Admiral, we prefer to think of it as learning.
Humans are naturally curious about other species and their capabilities. When you invited us to participate in galactic society, we accepted with enthusiasm. And used that participation to prepare for military action against us? We used that participation to understand how galactic society functions, including its military aspects. The fact that this understanding proved useful when we were forced to defend ourselves was coincidental. Ambassador Silex stood, her forearms moving in what humans had learned was an Aldani expression of alarm. Ambassador Sullivan, are you telling this assembly that humanity has been conducting intelligence operations against every major power for decades? No, Ambassador. We're telling you that humans learn from everything they encounter. When you allowed us access to your societies, we learned how your societies work. When you allowed us to observe your military exercises, we learned how your militaries function. When you sold us decommissioned equipment, we learned how your technologies operate. James paused to let the full implication settle. The intelligence we used wasn't gathered through espionage or covert operations. It was gathered through exactly the kind of cultural and scientific exchange that the Galactic Council promotes among member species. The silence in the assembly hall was profound as delegates began to understand the true scope of what they were dealing with. Chancellor Vexhai spoke carefully. Ambassador, what are humanity's intentions regarding galactic security? Do you intend to use this military capability aggressively? Chancellor, humanity seeks nothing more than the security of our worlds and the continuation of peaceful relations with all galactic species. We have no territorial ambitions, no desire for conquest, and no interest in subjugating other species. But you now possess the combined military knowledge and much of the equipment of 12 major powers, General Corvash pointed out. That makes you potentially the most powerful military force in the galaxy. General, we possess detailed knowledge of how 12 major powers approach warfare, along with examples of their equipment and tactical systems. What we've learned from studying those systems is that galactic military doctrine has some significant blind spots. What do you mean? James activated another display, this one showing comparative analyses of military effectiveness across different approaches to conflict. Every major power in the galaxy has optimized their military capabilities for fighting other major powers using conventional tactics. You've created an evolutionary dead end where everyone is perfectly adapted to fight the same kind of war. The display showed tactical effectiveness ratings for different military approaches under various scenarios. Human military doctrine isn't necessarily superior to yours in direct confrontation. But it's fundamentally different, and that difference means we can succeed in situations where conventional forces would fail. Ambassador Silex was studying the display intently. You're suggesting that galactic military doctrine has become vulnerable to non-conventional approaches? I'm suggesting that any system optimized for specific conditions becomes vulnerable to opponents who can operate outside those conditions. Humans evolved to operate outside any fixed conditions, Ambassador. Adaptability is our primary survival trait. The assembly was quiet as delegates processed the implications of what they had heard. The human military victory hadn't been a fluke or a lucky accident. It had been the result of a fundamentally different approach to survival and conflict that made humans uniquely dangerous to civilizations built around predictable, optimized systems. Chancellor Vexhai finally broke the silence as it, Ambassador Sullivan, what does humanity propose regarding future galactic security arrangements? We propose continued cooperation and peaceful relations, Chancellor, but we also suggest that the galaxy might benefit from reconsidering some assumptions about military effectiveness and security doctrine. What kind of reconsideration? The kind that recognizes that diversity in approach and adaptability in response might be more valuable than optimization and standardization. James looked around the assembly hall, meeting the gazes of representatives from civilizations that had just discovered they might need to fundamentally rethink their approach to survival in a galaxy that had suddenly become much more complex. The Hegemony Alliance brought overwhelming force to what they thought would be a simple conquest. Instead, they discovered that overwhelming force means nothing if your opponent understands you better than you understand yourself. He paused one final time before delivering his conclusion. Humanity offers friendship and cooperation to all species, but we also offer a reminder that the galaxy is full of surprises, and the most dangerous surprises come from those who see possibilities that others have overlooked. The ridiculous little human army had revealed itself to be something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. They had demonstrated that intelligence, adaptability, and understanding could trump raw power, advanced technology, and numerical superiority. Most importantly, they had shown that evolution didn't stop just because a species reached the stars. As the assembly adjourned and delegates began the long process of reconsidering everything they thought they knew about security and survival, one thing had become clear. The galaxy would never again make the mistake of underestimating the species that had learned to turn every disadvantage into an opportunity. The age of predictable warfare was over. The age of human adaptability had begun. A ridiculed little army shocked the galaxy. Because it was human, HFY Sci-Fi Stories.